The dust kicked up from Samuel Carter's boots as he rode his horse through the narrow canyon pass, the Arizona sun beating down mercilessly on his weathered hat. He had been tracking cattle thieves for 3 days, following their trail deeper into Apache territory than any white man should dare venture. The year was 1882, and tensions between settlers and the Apache tribes ran as hot as the desert sand beneath his horse's hooves. Samuel was not like other cowboys who passed through these lands. Where others saw enemies in every shadow and painted rock, he saw a people fighting to protect what remained of their ancestral home. His father had taught him to respect the land and those who understood it better than any newcomer ever could. This philosophy had kept him alive during his 5 years working cattle drives through the most dangerous territories in the Southwest. As his horse crested a small hill, Samuel spotted something that made his blood run cold. Below, in a shallow valley, 3 white men had cornered a young Apache woman against a cluster of red rocks. Even from a distance, he could see her traditional doeskin dress was torn, and she held her arm at an odd angle as if injured. The men were laughing, their intentions clear and vile. Without hesitation, Samuel spurred his horse down the slope, drawing his rifle as he rode. The thunder of hooves announced his approach, and the 3 men turned in surprise. They were rough-looking types, probably drifters or worse, the kind who believed Apache women had no protection under any law that mattered to them. The woman looked up at Samuel with dark eyes that showed no fear, only a fierce determination to fight until her last breath. Her name was Ayanna, though Samuel did not know this yet. She was the daughter of Nalnish, a respected war chief of the Chiricahua Apache, and she had been gathering medicinal plants when these men had spotted her. Samuel dismounted quickly, keeping his rifle trained on the 3 men. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He told them to step away from the woman and ride out, that there had been enough trouble in these parts without adding more. The largest of the 3 men, a bearded brute with tobacco-stained teeth, laughed and spat in the dirt. The man claimed they had found themselves an Apache princess and intended to have some fun before deciding what to do with her. His companions nodded agreement, their hands moving closer to their weapons. Samuel could see this would not end with words. The confrontation erupted into violence faster than a summer storm. Samuel's first shot took down the leader before the man could draw his gun. The second man managed to get off a wild shot that whistled past Samuel's ear before Samuel's return fire dropped him. The third man, seeing his companions fall, turned to run but found Ayanna had somehow gotten hold of a large rock despite her injured arm. She brought the stone down on the fleeing man's head with surprising force, and he crumpled to the ground unconscious. Samuel approached cautiously, unsure if the Apache woman would see him as another threat or a reluctant ally. She stood over the unconscious man, breathing heavily, her dark hair hanging loose around her shoulders. When Samuel spoke to her in the few Apache words he knew, asking if she was hurt, Ayanna's eyes widened in surprise. Few white men bothered to learn even basic phrases in her language. She responded in English, her voice carrying the musical accent of her people. She thanked him for his help but made it clear she could have handled the situation herself if necessary. Samuel examined her injured arm and determined it was badly bruised but not broken. As he helped her create a makeshift sling from strips of cloth torn from one of the dead men's shirts, Ayanna studied this strange cowboy who had risked his life for an Apache woman. She had heard stories of white men who showed respect for her people, but had never met one herself. The unconscious man began to stir, and Samuel faced a difficult decision. He could not leave the man to potentially cause more trouble, but he also could not bring himself to kill an unconscious enemy. Ayanna solved his dilemma by suggesting they tie the man to his horse and send the animal back toward the nearest settlement with a warning note pinned to the saddle. As they worked together to secure the unconscious man, Samuel learned that Ayanna had been gathering plants her grandmother needed to treat sick children in their camp. The location of these specific plants was a closely guarded secret, passed down through generations of Apache healers. She had taken a great risk coming so far from her people's protection. Samuel offered to escort her safely back toward Apache territory, knowing full well that approaching their lands could cost him his life if her people misunderstood his intentions. Ayanna accepted his offer, but warned him that her father's warriors might not be as understanding as she was about his presence in their territory. As they rode together through the late afternoon heat, Samuel found himself drawn to this remarkable woman who faced danger with such courage. Ayanna, for her part, was intrigued by a white man who showed genuine respect for Apache customs and seemed to understand that her people were fighting for survival, not conquest. They made camp that evening in a small canyon that offered protection from both the elements and prying eyes. As they shared Samuel's simple meal of jerky and hardtack around a small fire, Ayanna told him about her people's struggles to maintain their way of life in the face of increasing pressure from settlers and soldiers. Samuel listened without judgment, understanding more clearly than ever why the Apache fought so fiercely to protect their homeland. He shared his own story of growing up on a small ranch where his father had taught him that the land belonged to no one man, but that all who lived on it responsibly had a right to call it home. As the stars emerged overhead in the clear desert sky, both Samuel and Ayanna realized that their chance meeting had changed something fundamental in their lives. Neither could have predicted that this single act of intervention would set in motion events that would test their courage, challenge their loyalties, and ultimately determine whether love could bridge the growing divide between their two peoples. The unconscious man's horse had long since disappeared into the gathering darkness, carrying its burden back toward civilization and the promise of trouble to come. Samuel's second day in the Apache camp brought new challenges and unexpected revelations. He woke before dawn to the sound of horses moving through the valley and emerged from his lodge to see a group of warriors preparing for what appeared to be a serious mission. Their faces were painted with symbols he did not recognize, and their weapons gleamed in the early morning light. Ayanna appeared beside him, her expression troubled. She explained that scouts had brought word of a large cavalry patrol approaching from the east, led by a colonel known for his harsh treatment of Apache prisoners. The soldiers were still 2 days away, but they were moving directly toward the hidden valley, with a purpose that suggested someone had betrayed the location of the camp. Samuel's stomach dropped as he realized the implications. The man they had tied to the horse and sent away must have somehow learned enough about their location to guide the army back. His attempt to show mercy had potentially doomed the entire tribe. When he voiced this fear to Ayanna, she shook her head firmly. She had considered the same possibility, but her brother Casa had followed the unconscious man's trail and reported that he had ridden directly back toward the nearest town without deviation. More likely, the betrayal had come from one of the Apache who had been forced onto the reservation but occasionally returned to trade information for better treatment from the authorities. The war council that followed was unlike anything Samuel had ever witnessed. Warriors, elders, and respected women gathered in a circle, each speaking their thoughts about how to respond to the approaching threat. Some argued for immediate evacuation to even more remote territory, while others wanted to prepare ambush positions to make the soldiers pay dearly for finding their sanctuary. Samuel found himself in an impossible position. As a white man, his presence during these discussions was unprecedented, yet Ayanna's protection extended to including him in tribal decisions that would affect his fate as much as theirs. When Nalnish asked for his thoughts, Samuel faced a moment that would define not only his relationship with the Apache, but his own sense of honor. He spoke carefully, acknowledging that his opinion might not be welcome, but offering it nonetheless. The approaching soldiers would be expecting either a deserted camp or a fierce fight. They would not expect to find a white man living peacefully among the Apache, acting as proof that cooperation between their peoples was possible. Samuel proposed something that shocked everyone present. He suggested that he ride out to meet the cavalry patrol alone, carrying a message of peace and an offer to arrange negotiations between the military commanders and the Apache leadership. His presence would demonstrate that the Apache had treated a white captive with honor, potentially changing the colonel's expectations about the situation. The reaction was immediate and intense. Several warriors shouted their objections, calling the plan foolish and naive. They argued that soldiers would never believe Samuel had been treated well, and would instead assume he had been tortured or brainwashed. Others pointed out that even if the colonel listened, the Army's orders were likely to force all Apache onto reservations regardless of any peaceful overtures. Ayanna surprised everyone by speaking in support of Samuel's proposal, but with a crucial modification. She would accompany him to the meeting with the soldiers, demonstrating her trust in his good faith and her willingness to risk her life for the possibility of peace. Together, they could present a united front that might give the military commander reason to pause and consider alternatives to violence. Her father's response was swift and absolute. He forbade Ayana from exposing herself to such danger, pointing out that she was not just his daughter, but also the keeper of important tribal knowledge that would die with her. The heated argument that followed revealed the deep divisions within the Apache leadership about how to face the changing world around them. As the debate continued, Samuel began to understand the impossible position Nalnish faced as a leader. Every decision carried the potential for disaster, and the margin for error grew smaller with each passing month. The traditional Apache way of warfare worked well against small groups of settlers or isolated army patrols, but it was no match for the organized campaigns now being mounted against them. The War Council eventually reached a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but offered the best chance for survival. A small group of warriors would begin evacuating the children, elderly, and essential supplies to a backup location deeper in the mountains. Meanwhile, Samuel would indeed ride out to meet the cavalry patrol, but he would be accompanied by Casa and 2 other warriors who would observe the meeting from hidden positions. If Samuel was killed or captured, the warriors would report back to the tribe, and preparations for battle would begin immediately. If he succeeded in arranging a parley, the tribe would consider participating, but only on their own terms and in a location of their choosing. Ayana was assigned the crucial task of leading the evacuation group, a responsibility that both honored her abilities and ensured her safety. Samuel could see her frustration at being protected, rather than allowed to participate directly in the dangerous mission, but she accepted her father's decision with the grace of someone trained from childhood to put the tribe's welfare above her personal desires. That evening, as Samuel prepared for what might be his final night alive, Ayana came to his lodge carrying her grandmother's medicine bag. The old woman, she explained, was the most respected healer in the tribe and had insisted on providing Samuel with protection for his journey. The bag contained herbs and sacred objects that would bring him luck and courage in the face of danger. As Ayana tied the medicine bag around Samuel's neck, their hands touched briefly, and both felt an electric connection that neither had experienced before. The moment lasted only seconds, but it carried the weight of unspoken feelings that had been growing between them since their first meeting. Samuel found the courage to tell Ayana that meeting her had changed his understanding of what was possible between their peoples. If he survived the encounter with the cavalry patrol, he wanted the chance to explore whether the connection they felt could grow into something deeper and more lasting. Ayana's response revealed the depth of her own feelings. She admitted that she had never expected to care about a white man, but Samuel had shown her that individual character mattered more than race or tribal affiliation. However, she also warned him that even if they both survived the immediate danger, their path together would be filled with obstacles that might prove insurmountable. The tribal law was clear about relationships between Apache women and outsiders. While not forbidden entirely, such unions required the approval of the war chief and the tribal council, along with proof that the outsider could contribute meaningfully to the tribe's welfare. Samuel would need to demonstrate not just his good intentions but also his ability to live as an Apache warrior if he truly wanted to make a life with Ayana. As they said goodnight, both Samuel and Ayana understood that the next few days would determine not only their personal futures, but also the fate of her people. The approaching cavalry patrol represented more than just an immediate military threat. It symbolized the relentless pressure that was slowly destroying the traditional Apache way of life. Samuel spent his last hours in the hidden valley memorizing every detail: the sound of the stream flowing through the camp, the smell of smoke from the lodge fires, the laughter of children playing games their ancestors had enjoyed for generations. Whatever happened when he rode out to meet the soldiers, he wanted to carry these peaceful memories with him as proof that Apache and white people could live together in harmony if they chose to do so. The pre-dawn preparations began while the stars still shone overhead, and Samuel knew that sunrise would bring either the beginning of a new understanding between their peoples or the start of another bloody chapter in the long history of conflict between Apache and white settlers in the Arizona territory. The morning sun painted the canyon walls gold as Samuel woke to find Ayana already awake, tending to the dying embers of their campfire. She had removed the makeshift sling during the night, and though her arm was still tender, she moved with the fluid grace of someone raised in harmony with the harsh desert environment. Samuel watched quietly as she performed what appeared to be a morning ritual, facing east and speaking softly in Apache to greet the new day. When she finished her prayers, Ayanna turned to find Samuel respectfully waiting. She appreciated that he had not interrupted or stared rudely at her customs. Most white men either mocked Apache traditions or watched with the curiosity reserved for strange animals. This cowboy showed the courtesy of someone who understood that all people had sacred practices deserving of respect. They broke camp efficiently, working together with an ease that surprised them both. As they prepared to continue toward Apache territory, Samuel noticed fresh tracks in the soft sand near their camping spot. The prints were unshod ponies, and they circled their camp at a distance. Apache scouts had found them during the night but had chosen not to approach. Ayanna examined the tracks and nodded grimly. Her brother Casa's distinctive horse prints were among them. He was known for his fierce protection of their family and his deep suspicion of all white men. The fact that he had not attacked during the night meant he was either being very cautious or waiting for orders from their father. As they rode through the morning heat, Ayanna told Samuel more about her family. Her father Nalnish was struggling to keep their band together, as pressure mounted from all sides. The U.S. Army was pushing harder to force all Apache onto reservations, while settlers demanded more protection from Apache raids. Some warriors wanted to fight to the death rather than surrender their freedom, while others argued that negotiation was their only hope for survival. Samuel shared his own observations about the changing times. He had seen good men on both sides destroyed by fear and misunderstanding. His own boss, a fair rancher named Tom Brennan, was under constant pressure from nervous neighbors to hire more gunmen and take a harder line against any Apache presence in the area. Samuel knew that Tom wanted peace, but the man was caught between his conscience and the demands of survival in an increasingly violent territory. Their conversation was interrupted by the appearance of 3 Apache warriors on a ridge ahead. Even at a distance, Samuel could see they were painted for war, their horses prancing with nervous energy. Ayanna raised her good arm in a gesture Samuel did not understand, and one of the warriors responded with a similar motion. She explained that these were her cousin's men, and they had been instructed to escort them safely to the main camp. However, Samuel would need to surrender his weapons and allow himself to be blindfolded for the final approach to their hidden settlement. It was a reasonable precaution, but one that left Samuel completely dependent on Ayanna's protection. The decision to trust her completely was easier than Samuel expected. Over the past day, he had come to respect not only her courage but also her honesty. If she intended to betray him, she could have done so many times already. He handed over his rifle, pistol, and knife without hesitation, then allowed one of the warriors to tie a cloth over his eyes. The blindfolded ride lasted nearly 2 hours, winding through terrain that seemed to climb steadily upward. Samuel could hear water flowing somewhere nearby and smell the distinctive scent of juniper trees. His horse followed the others with sure steps, guided by warriors who knew every rock and crevice of this secret path. When the blindfold was finally removed, Samuel found himself in a hidden valley that took his breath away. The Apache camp was larger than he had expected, with perhaps 60 lodges scattered among stands of oak and pine trees. A clear stream ran through the center of the valley, and children played in the shallows while women worked at various tasks nearby. The arrival of a white man in their secret stronghold caused an immediate stir. Warriors appeared from seemingly nowhere, and Samuel found himself surrounded by stern faces and drawn weapons. Women gathered their children protectively, while elders emerged from their lodges to assess this unusual situation. Ayanna spoke rapidly in Apache, clearly explaining the circumstances that had brought Samuel to their camp. Her father Nalnish emerged from a large lodge in the center of the settlement. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, with silver streaking his long black hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His dark eyes studied Samuel with an intensity that seemed to see into his soul. The war chief approached slowly, and Samuel forced himself to remain still and respectful, despite the weapons pointed at him from all directions. Ayanna continued speaking to her father, and Samuel caught enough words to understand she was describing the confrontation with the 3 white men and Samuel's intervention on her behalf. Nalnish listened, without interruption, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. When Ayanna finished her account, he stepped closer to Samuel and spoke in heavily accented English. He asked why a white cowboy would risk his life to help an Apache woman he did not know. Samuel answered honestly, explaining that he had been raised to believe that protecting those who could not protect themselves was simply the right thing to do, regardless of the color of their skin or the tribe they belonged to. He added that he had seen enough violence and injustice to know that good people existed among all races, just as evil ones did. The war chief considered this response for a long moment before asking Samuel about his knowledge of Apache customs and his reasons for learning their language. Samuel explained that his father had traded peacefully with various tribes during his younger years, and had taught his son that understanding led to respect, while ignorance led to fear and hatred. Nalnish spoke again to his daughter, asking questions that Samuel could not fully understand. Ayanna answered each one directly, meeting her father's gaze without flinching. Samuel sensed that some kind of test or evaluation was taking place, with his life hanging in the balance. Finally, the war chief announced his decision to the assembled tribe. Samuel would be allowed to remain in their camp for 3 days as a guest, long enough for his actions to be properly evaluated and for the elders to determine whether he could be trusted. During this time, he would be under Ayanna's protection and responsibility. If he proved unworthy of their hospitality, or if his presence brought danger to the tribe, she would share his fate. Ayanna accepted this arrangement without hesitation, a gesture that both moved and terrified Samuel. She was literally betting her life on his character and intentions. As the crowd began to disperse, she led him toward a small lodge where he would stay during his time in the valley. That evening, as Samuel sat beside a small fire outside his temporary home, he reflected on the incredible turn his life had taken. Yesterday he had been a simple cowboy tracking cattle thieves. Now he found himself as possibly the first white man ever to be welcomed, however tentatively, into this hidden Apache stronghold. Ayanna joined him as the stars emerged overhead, bringing a bowl of stew made from venison and wild plants. As they shared the meal, she explained that her father's decision had surprised many in the tribe. Some warriors had argued for killing him immediately, while others had suggested holding him hostage for negotiations with the white authorities. Samuel asked what had changed Nalnish's mind, and Ayanna smiled for the first time since he had known her. She explained that her father was a practical man who understood that the old ways were ending. The time might come when having a white friend could mean the difference between survival and extinction for their people. Samuel represented a possibility that few Apache had ever considered, that perhaps some white men could be trusted as allies rather than feared as enemies. The morning mist still clung to the canyon walls as Samuel rode out from the Apache camp, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. Casa and the 2 warrior escorts had melted into the landscape around him, invisible but present, ready to witness whatever transpired with the approaching cavalry patrol. Samuel carried no weapons except for a small knife Nalnish had returned to him, along with a white cloth tied to a stick as a symbol of his peaceful intentions. The ride toward the cavalry patrol took him through some of the most beautiful and treacherous terrain in Arizona territory. Red rock formations towered overhead like ancient cathedrals, while hidden valleys and narrow passages created a maze that had protected Apache secrets for generations. Samuel understood why his blindfolded journey to the camp had been necessary. Even now, knowing the general direction, he doubted he could find his way back without Apache guidance. As he crested a ridge overlooking a broad valley, Samuel spotted the dust cloud that marked the cavalry patrol's approach. Even at a distance, he could see this was no routine scouting mission. The column included supply wagons, pack mules, and what appeared to be civilian scouts, suggesting a major operation designed to locate and capture or destroy Apache resistance in the area. Samuel urged his horse down into the valley, riding directly toward the advancing column with his improvised flag of truce held high. The response was immediate and alarming. Scouts at the front of the column spotted him and immediately wheeled their horses back toward the main force. Within minutes, Samuel could see soldiers forming a skirmish line, their weapons trained on his approaching figure. A bugle call echoed across the valley, and the entire column came to a halt. Samuel continued his approach at a steady walk, fighting every instinct that urged him to turn and flee. When he was within rifle range, a voice shouted for him to stop and identify himself. Samuel reined in his horse and called out that he was an American citizen seeking to speak with the commanding officer under a flag of Truce. The tense standoff that followed seemed to stretch for hours, but probably lasted only minutes. Samuel could see soldiers whispering among themselves, clearly uncertain about how to handle the appearance of a lone white man in the heart of Apache territory. Finally, a small group of officers rode forward, their hands resting on their weapon handles but not yet drawn. The commanding officer was exactly what Samuel had expected. A career soldier whose weathered face spoke of years fighting Indians on the frontier. Colonel Morrison wore his authority-like armor, and his pale blue eyes studied Samuel with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to life-or-death decisions. When he spoke, his voice carried the crisp authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. Morrison demanded to know Samuel's identity, his business in Apache territory, and whether he was being held captive. Samuel answered each question honestly, explaining that he was a cowboy who had helped an Apache woman escape from attackers and had been invited to their camp as a gesture of goodwill. He made it clear that he was free to leave at any time and had come voluntarily to arrange a meeting between the colonel and the Apache leadership. The colonel's reaction was a mixture of disbelief and suspicion. He pointed out that Samuel's story was unlikely at best, given the Apache reputation for killing white captives rather than entertaining them as guests. Morrison suggested that Samuel had either been brainwashed by his captors or was deliberately lying to protect them, either of which indicated he could not be trusted as a reliable intermediary. Samuel had anticipated this response and came prepared with evidence to support his claims. He showed Morrison the medicine bag Ayana's grandmother had given him, explaining its significance as a gesture of trust from the tribal healer. He also described details about the Apache camp that he could only have learned through peaceful interaction, rather than as a prisoner. More importantly, Samuel offered to provide information that could prevent unnecessary bloodshed on both sides. He warned Morrison that the Apache were already aware of the cavalry patrol's approach, and were prepared either to fight or to disappear deeper into territory where the soldiers would never find them. A direct assault on their positions would likely result in heavy casualties for the cavalry while allowing most of the Apache to escape. Colonel Morrison listened to Samuel's proposal for a peaceful meeting with growing interest, but his response revealed the political pressures that constrained his options. His orders from the territorial governor and the War Department were explicit. All Apache in the area were to be captured and transported to reservations immediately, with force authorized if they refused to surrender voluntarily. The colonel explained that recent Apache raids on settlements and supply wagons had created public pressure for decisive military action. Newspaper editorials were demanding that the Army take a harder line against what they called savage depredations, and political careers were being built on promises to make Arizona territory safe for white settlers. A negotiated settlement might be militarily sensible, but it would be politically disastrous for everyone involved. Samuel pressed his case by appealing to Morrison's professional pride and concern for his men's lives. He pointed out that the Apache leader Nalnish was known as a reasonable man, who understood that his people's traditional way of life was ending. Given the opportunity to negotiate terms that would protect his followers' dignity, while accepting the reality of white expansion, he might be willing to agree to relocation without a fight. The turning point in their conversation came when Samuel mentioned that he had witnessed Apache children playing in the hidden camp. Morrison, who had children of his own back in Kansas, visibly softened at the reminder that the enemy he was pursuing included families trying to survive in an increasingly hostile world. After a long pause, Colonel Morrison made a decision that could end his military career if it went wrong. He agreed to postpone his assault for 48 hours, while Samuel attempted to arrange a meeting with the Apache leadership. However, the colonel's terms were non-negotiable. The meeting would take place on neutral ground of Morrison's choosing, with equal numbers of representatives from both sides and a clear understanding that this was a surrender negotiation, not a peace treaty discussion. Samuel accepted these conditions, knowing they would be difficult for Nalnish to agree to, but hoping that the war chief's wisdom would recognize this as possibly their last chance to avoid a battle they could not win. As he prepared to ride back toward the Apache camp, Morrison issued a warning that chilled Samuel's blood. The colonel revealed that Samuel's presence in Apache territory had already been reported to territorial authorities by the survivor of the confrontation 3 days earlier. A warrant had been issued for Samuel's arrest on charges of collaborating with hostile Indians, and federal marshals were en route to the area. Even if the negotiations succeeded, Samuel would face imprisonment or worse for his actions. This revelation forced Samuel to confront the full implications of his choice to help Ayanna. He had not only risked his life, but had also effectively made himself an outlaw in the eyes of the government he had served faithfully as a law-abiding citizen. There could be no going back to his old life regardless of what happened in the next 2 days. As Samuel rode away from the cavalry patrol, he reflected on how quickly his world had changed. A week ago, his biggest concern had been tracking cattle thieves for his employer. Now he found himself serving as an unlikely diplomat between two peoples locked in a conflict that seemed to have no solution, acceptable to both sides. The hidden Apache scouts had undoubtedly observed his entire conversation with Colonel Morrison, and Samuel knew that his report to Nalnish would be compared carefully with their independent observations. Any discrepancy or perceived deception would cost him not only the tribe's trust, but probably his life as well. The sun was reaching its zenith as Samuel began the journey back to the hidden valley, carrying with him the weight of 2 civilizations' hopes and fears. In 48 hours, he would learn whether his desperate gamble for peace had any chance of success, or whether he had merely delayed the inevitable bloodshed that seemed to follow wherever Apache and white men encountered each other in the Arizona territory. Behind him, Colonel Morrison's cavalry patrol resumed its methodical advance, ready for either negotiation or war, depending on how the next 2 days unfolded. Samuel's return to the Apache camp created an immediate stir of activity that rippled through the hidden valley like stones thrown into still water. Warriors emerged from concealed positions where they had been watching the approaches, while women and children who had been quietly going about their daily tasks suddenly focused their attention on the dust-covered cowboy riding back into their sanctuary. Nalnish waited for Samuel outside the war chief's lodge, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts as he listened to the report of what had transpired with Colonel Morrison. Casa and the other warrior escorts had already returned with their own observations, providing an independent account that would be carefully compared with Samuel's version of events. The war council that convened within the hour was even more intense than the previous day's gathering. Samuel found himself in the unprecedented position of reporting military intelligence to Apache leaders who were deciding how to respond to an immediate threat to their people's survival. The weight of his responsibility was almost overwhelming as he realized that his words might determine whether the next sunrise brought peace or war to the hidden valley. Samuel reported Colonel Morrison's offer accurately, emphasizing both the opportunity it represented and the harsh terms that came with it. The colonel's 48-hour deadline meant that any negotiation would take place under the constant threat of military action, while his insistence on treating the meeting as a surrender discussion rather than peace talks revealed the limited options available to the Apache. The debate that followed exposed the deep divisions within the Apache leadership about how to respond to the changing world around them. Elder warriors who had fought Mexican soldiers and American cavalry for decades argued that any negotiation was merely a trap designed to lure Apache leaders into captivity or death. They pointed to broken treaties and violated agreements as evidence that white promises were worthless. Younger warriors, led by Casa, took a different but equally militant position. They argued that if conflict was inevitable, it should begin on Apache terms rather than waiting for the cavalry to dictate the time and place of battle. The hidden valley's defensive advantages would never be better, and every day of delay allowed more soldiers to arrive in the territory. The Women's Council, led by Ayanna's grandmother, brought a perspective that the warriors had not fully considered. They pointed out that the approaching winter would make extended resistance almost impossible, especially with children and elderly tribal members who could not endure the hardships of a prolonged flight through hostile territory. The time for pure military solutions had passed, and survival now required political wisdom as much as warrior courage. Ayanna herself argued passionately for giving negotiation a chance, not because she trusted the white government's promises, but because she believed Samuel's presence offered a unique opportunity to change the dynamic of the situation. His willingness to risk everything to help her people had already demonstrated that some white men could be trusted, and his status as an intermediary might provide face-saving options for both sides. Nalnish listened to all viewpoints before revealing information that changed everyone's calculations. Apache scouts had reported the approach of additional military units from 2 other directions, suggesting a coordinated campaign designed to trap the tribe in their mountain stronghold. Colonel Morrison's patrol was just the advance element of a much larger operation that would make resistance futile regardless of the immediate tactical situation. The war chief's analysis was coldly realistic. The Apache could fight and die with honor, achieving nothing except the satisfaction of making the white soldiers pay dearly for their victory. They could attempt to flee deeper into Mexico, abandoning their ancestral lands forever and facing an uncertain reception from Mexican authorities who had their own conflicts with Apache raiders. Or they could gamble on Samuel's negotiation offer, hoping to secure terms that would at least preserve their people's lives if not their traditional way of life. Samuel found himself asked to provide his honest assessment of Colonel Morrison's character and the likelihood that negotiations would produce acceptable terms. This was perhaps the most difficult question he had ever faced, because he knew that his answer would influence decisions affecting the lives of everyone in the Hidden Valley. He told the War Council that Morrison appeared to be an honorable soldier operating under orders that left him little flexibility, but also a man who cared about avoiding unnecessary bloodshed. The colonel's agreement to delay his attack suggested he was genuinely interested in finding a peaceful solution, but the political pressures he faced would limit what he could offer. More importantly, Samuel shared Colonel Morrison's revelation about the warrant for his own arrest. This information shocked the Apache leaders, who had not fully understood the personal cost Samuel was paying for his involvement in their affairs. The fact that he had chosen to return to their camp, despite knowing he was now a wanted man, demonstrated a level of commitment that impressed even his strongest critics. Nalnish made his decision with the weight of his people's future resting on his shoulders. The tribe would send representatives to meet with Colonel Morrison, but on terms that preserved Apache dignity, while acknowledging the reality of their situation. Samuel would serve as the primary intermediary, with Ayanna accompanying him as a translator and cultural liaison, despite her father's obvious reluctance to expose her to such danger. The negotiating position Nalnish outlined was carefully crafted to provide maximum flexibility while protecting core Apache interests. The tribe would consider relocation to a reservation, but only if they could choose which reservation and retain the right to hunt and gather traditional foods during certain seasons. They would surrender their weapons as a gesture of good faith, but wanted guarantees that Apache children would be educated in both white and traditional ways, rather than being forced to abandon their culture entirely. Most importantly, Nalnish demanded that any agreement include provisions for Apache who chose not to relocate. A small number of warriors and their families should be allowed to remain in the mountains as scouts and guides for the U.S. Army, providing a legitimate way for some tribal members to maintain their connection to ancestral lands while serving a useful purpose for the government. Samuel understood that these terms were far more generous than anything the Apache could realistically expect to receive, but he also recognized the wisdom in starting negotiations with an ambitious proposal. If Colonel Morrison rejected everything outright, it would demonstrate to his own people that negotiation was indeed futile. If he accepted some elements while rejecting others, it would provide a foundation for meaningful compromise. The most difficult part of Nalnish's instructions concerned Samuel's own future. The war chief made it clear that if negotiations succeeded, Samuel would be welcome to remain with the tribe permanently, taking Ayanna as his wife if she agreed, and learning to live as an Apache warrior. However, this offer came with the understanding that Samuel could never return to white society without facing arrest and imprisonment. As preparations began for the dangerous journey to meet Colonel Morrison, Samuel found himself alone with Ayanna for the first time since his return from the cavalry patrol. She had volunteered to serve as translator despite knowing the risks, and Samuel felt compelled to give her one last chance to reconsider her decision. Ayanna's response revealed the depth of her feelings and the strength of her character. She explained that she had been raised to believe that Apache women were the backbone of their people, responsible for preserving culture and ensuring survival in times of crisis. Her participation in the negotiations was not just about her personal relationship with Samuel, but about her duty to help her people navigate the most dangerous period in their history, she also confessed that watching Samuel risk everything for people he barely knew had awakened feelings she had never expected to experience. Apache tradition taught that love should be based on respect, shared values, and mutual commitment to family and tribe. Samuel had demonstrated all of these qualities in ways that impressed not only her but also the tribal elders, who would normally be most suspicious of any outsider. The night before their departure, for the negotiation site passed quietly, with both Samuel and Ayanna acutely aware that it might be their last peaceful moments together. They sat by a small fire outside the lodge where Samuel had stayed, talking about their hopes and fears for the future, while carefully avoiding promises that circumstances might make impossible to keep. Ayanna told Samuel about her childhood in the Hidden Valley, describing a life of freedom and connection to the natural world that was already becoming impossible for Apache children to experience. She spoke of learning healing arts from her grandmother, tracking skills from her father, and the deep spiritual connection to the land that made relocation to a reservation feel like a kind of living death. Samuel shared his own memories of growing up on his father's small ranch, where he had learned to see the land as a partner, rather than something to be conquered. His father's respect for Apache knowledge had shaped Samuel's understanding that different peoples could have valuable lessons to teach each other if they approached their differences with curiosity rather than fear. As the stars wheeled overhead in the clear desert sky, both Samuel and Ayanna understood that they were caught in forces much larger than their personal feelings for each other. The love growing between them represented a possibility that transcended the hatred and misunderstanding that had characterized relations between their peoples. But it also made them vulnerable to accusations of betrayal from both sides. The dawn brought final preparations for a journey that would determine not only the fate of Nalnish's band, but also the future of Apache resistance throughout the territory. Samuel checked his horse's equipment one last time, while Ayanna gathered the ceremonial items she would need to demonstrate her authority as the war chief's daughter and official representative. Other tribal members came to offer their blessings and prayers for the mission's success, but Samuel could see the doubt in many faces. Too many promises had been broken, and too many peaceful Apache had died while carrying white flags for anyone to feel confident about the outcome of negotiations with Colonel Morrison. Casa approached Samuel with obvious reluctance, offering a warrior's blessing despite his personal reservations about trusting any white man with his sister's safety. The gesture meant more to Samuel than he could express, representing acceptance from someone who had every reason to view him as an enemy. As Samuel and Ayanna rode out of the Hidden Valley together, both understood that they were embarking on more than just a diplomatic mission. They were testing whether love could bridge the gap between two worlds that seemed destined for eternal conflict, and whether individual courage could change the course of history when entire peoples stood poised on the brink of war. The morning sun painted the canyon walls gold as they began their journey toward an uncertain fate, carrying with them the hopes of a people fighting for survival and the fragile possibility that understanding might triumph over hatred in a land where violence had become the common language between Apache and white settlers. The meeting place Colonel Morrison had chosen was a broad mesa that rose like a natural amphitheater from the desert floor, offering clear sightlines in all directions and making ambush impossible for either side. Samuel and Ayanna arrived first, using the extra time to survey the terrain and prepare for what might be the most important conversation in the recent history of Apache-white relations. Ayanna spread a traditional blanket on the red sandstone and arranged the ceremonial items she had brought to demonstrate her authority as Nalnish's representative. The sight of these sacred objects in such a setting drove home the gravity of what they were attempting. For the first time in living memory, an Apache woman would sit as an equal in negotiations with U.S. military officers, speaking not as a supplicant, but as the voice of a sovereign people. The cavalry patrol approached with military precision, dust clouds announcing their arrival long before the first riders became visible. Samuel counted 20 soldiers in the main group, with additional scouts positioned on surrounding ridges to provide security. Colonel Morrison had brought enough firepower to handle trouble, but not so much as to make the meeting feel like a military occupation. Morrison himself rode at the head of a small group that included his second-in-command, a civilian interpreter who supposedly spoke Apache, and a man Samuel didn't recognize until he got closer. The stranger wore the badge of a federal marshal, and Samuel's heart sank as he realized that the colonel had brought law enforcement to arrest him regardless of how the negotiations proceeded. The formal introductions that followed were unlike anything anyone present had ever experienced. Ayanna spoke first in Apache, offering traditional greetings and invoking the protection of the spirits for all participants in the discussion. Her words carried the musical cadences of her language, and even those who couldn't understand them seemed affected by their dignity and grace. Colonel Morrison responded with military courtesy, acknowledging Ayanna's status as an official representative while making it clear that he viewed the gathering as a surrender negotiation rather than a treaty discussion between equals. The federal marshal, introduced as Deputy Marshal Williams, said nothing but watched Samuel with the focused attention of a predator studying potential prey. Samuel found himself in the delicate position of serving as both translator and advocate, trying to bridge not only language differences but also fundamentally different worldviews about the nature of the conflict and the possibilities for resolution. Every word he spoke carried the potential to either advance the cause of peace or trigger the violent confrontation everyone was trying to avoid. The negotiations began with Colonel Morrison, outlining the government's position with military directness. All Apache in the territory were to surrender unconditionally and submit to relocation to the San Carlos Reservation in southeastern Arizona. They would be provided with food, shelter, and protection in exchange for giving up their weapons and agreeing to remain within reservation boundaries under military supervision. Ayanna's response, delivered through Samuel's translation, revealed the sophisticated political thinking that had kept her people alive through centuries of conflict with stronger enemies. She acknowledged the military reality that made continued resistance futile, but pointed out that cooperation based on mutual respect would be more stable than submission based purely on force. She presented Nalnish's alternative proposal with eloquence that impressed even Colonel Morrison. The Apache would consider relocation, but wanted the right to choose between San Carlos and other available reservations. They would surrender most weapons but retain hunting equipment necessary for supplementing government rations with traditional foods. Most importantly, they wanted guarantees that Apache children would receive education that included their own language and customs alongside English and white cultural training. Colonel Morrison's response revealed both his personal sympathy and the political constraints that limited his options. He admitted that Ayanna's proposals were reasonable and would probably result in better long-term outcomes for everyone involved. However, his orders from territorial and federal authorities allowed for no negotiation beyond the terms of surrender he had already outlined. The deadlock that followed might have ended the negotiations before they truly began, but Samuel introduced an element that neither side had fully considered. He pointed out that the Apache proposals could be implemented gradually, beginning with unconditional surrender that satisfied Morrison's orders while leaving room for administrative decisions about reservation assignment and educational policies to be made later by officials with more flexibility. This approach offered both sides a way to save face while achieving their essential objectives. Morrison could report that the Apache had surrendered unconditionally, satisfying his military and political superiors. The Apache could surrender in the hope that good behavior would lead to consideration of their requests for better treatment once the immediate crisis had passed. Ayanna saw the wisdom in Samuel's suggestion but insisted on one additional element that revealed her understanding of white legal processes. She wanted Morrison to put his personal recommendation in writing that Apache cooperation during the surrender process be rewarded with consideration of their requests for better reservation assignment and educational policies. The colonel's agreement to this condition surprised everyone, including his own officers. Morrison explained that his military career was nearing its end anyway, and he preferred to be remembered for finding a peaceful solution rather than for conducting another bloody campaign against families fighting for their children's futures. As the formal terms were being discussed, Deputy Marshal Williams finally spoke up to address the issue that had been hanging over the entire proceeding. He informed Samuel that a federal warrant had been issued for his arrest on charges of providing aid and comfort to hostile Indians, and that he was legally obligated to take Samuel into custody, regardless of the outcome of negotiations. Samuel's response demonstrated the transformation he had undergone since first encountering Ayanna in the desert. He stated calmly that he understood the legal consequences of his actions and was prepared to face them, but requested that his arrest be delayed until the surrender process was complete to avoid undermining the agreement. They had just reached Ayanna's reaction to this development revealed the depth of her feelings and her understanding of what Samuel's sacrifice meant for her people. She spoke directly to Deputy Marshal Williams in English, explaining that Samuel had risked everything to prevent bloodshed and asking whether the government really wanted to punish someone who had helped achieve peace without firing a shot. The Marshal's response showed that he was not unsympathetic to Samuel's situation, but explained that political pressure from territorial authorities had made Samuel's arrest a priority. Too many voters were demanding action against anyone. Priority. Too many voters were demanding action against anyone perceived as helping hostile Indians, and territorial officials needed to demonstrate that such behavior would not be tolerated. Colonel Morrison surprised everyone by offering a solution that reflected his growing respect for both Samuel and Ayanna. He proposed that Samuel be allowed to accompany the Apache to the reservation as a civilian advisor to help with the transition process, effectively placing him in protective custody while avoiding the public spectacle of a formal arrest. This arrangement would satisfy the legal requirement to take Samuel into custody while allowing him to continue helping the Apache adapt to reservation life. More importantly, it would give him and Ayanna a chance to explore their relationship without the immediate threat of separation hanging over them. The final agreement that emerged from the Mesa meeting was far from perfect, but it represented something unprecedented in the history of Apache-white relations. For the first time, Apache surrender had been negotiated rather than imposed, with both sides making meaningful concessions to achieve a peaceful resolution. As the sun began to set over the Arizona desert, Samuel and Ayanna found themselves facing an uncertain future that nevertheless held more hope than either had dared to imagine when they first met. The immediate crisis had been resolved, but the greater challenge of building a life together across the divide between their two worlds was just beginning. The journey back to the hidden valley would be their last time alone together before the surrender process began, and both understood that everything that followed would test not only their love for each other, but also their faith in the possibility that understanding could triumph over hatred. In a land where violence had become the common language between peoples who shared the same earth but saw it through completely different eyes, the surrender ceremony, 3 days later, was unlike any event in the recorded history of the Arizona Territory. Instead of the typical scene of defeated warriors laying down their weapons in sullen resignation, Nalnish's band approached the designated meeting point with the dignity of a people choosing cooperation over destruction, while maintaining their essential identity as Apache. Samuel stood beside Colonel Morrison as the procession approached, watching Ayanna ride at her father's side with the bearing of someone representing not just her family, but the hopes of future generations. The morning sun caught the silver ornaments in her hair and the beadwork on her ceremonial dress, creating an image that would remain burned in Samuel's memory for the rest of his life. The formal ceremony began with Nalnish speaking in Apache, his words carrying across the desert air with the gravity of someone marking the end of an era. Ayanna translated for the assembled soldiers and officials, explaining that her father was not surrendering in defeat but choosing a new path that might allow their children to survive in a changing world, while keeping alive the essential spirit of what it meant to be Apache. The war chief's speech acknowledged the military reality that made continued resistance impossible, but also expressed hope that cooperation might lead to understanding between peoples who had been enemies for too long. He spoke of Samuel as proof that individual white men could learn to see Apache as human beings deserving of respect rather than obstacles to be removed from the land. When Nalnish presented his rifle to Colonel Morrison, the gesture carried symbolic weight that transcended the simple act of weapon surrender. The war chief explained through Ayanna's translation that he was entrusting his people's future to the colonel's honor, believing that Morrison would remember this day when making decisions about Apache welfare in the months and years to come. Morrison's response demonstrated the profound effect the negotiation process had on his own understanding of the conflict. He accepted the rifle with visible emotion, promising that he would do everything in his power to ensure that Apache cooperation was rewarded with fair treatment and consideration for their requests regarding reservation, assignment, and educational policies. The individual surrender of weapons by Apache warriors created a series of moments that revealed the complex emotions surrounding the ceremony. Some men handed over their rifles with obvious reluctance, while others seemed relieved to be laying down arms they had carried for years without rest. The women and children watched in silence, understanding that they were witnessing the end of the only way of life they had ever known. Case's surrender was perhaps the most poignant moment of the entire ceremony. Ayana's brother had been among the most vocal opponents of negotiation, arguing that death in battle was preferable to life on a reservation. Yet when his turn came, he approached Samuel directly and offered his rifle with words that surprised everyone present. Speaking in careful English he had never used before, Casa told Samuel that he still did not trust white men in general, but had learned to trust Samuel specifically. He asked Samuel to remember that Apache warriors had chosen cooperation not from weakness, but from love for their families and hope for their children's futures. The emotional climax of the ceremony came when Ayana formally requested permission to marry Samuel according to both Apache and white customs. This was unprecedented in territorial history, and the request created a moment of complete silence as everyone present realized they were witnessing something that would change how both peoples viewed the possibility of peaceful coexistence. Nalnish's public approval of the marriage proposal carried enormous symbolic significance. By blessing his daughter's union with a white man who had proven his loyalty to Apache welfare, the war chief was demonstrating his belief that the future belonged to those who could bridge the gap between different worlds, rather than those who insisted on maintaining absolute separation. Colonel Morrison's response revealed how much his own attitudes had evolved during the negotiation process. He agreed to serve as official witness to the marriage ceremony, explaining that Samuel and Ayana represented the kind of understanding between peoples that might prevent future conflicts if given a chance to flourish. Deputy Marshal Williams provided the final surprise of the ceremony by announcing that federal authorities had agreed to suspend the warrant for Samuel's arrest in recognition of his role in achieving peaceful surrender. Instead of facing imprisonment, Samuel would be appointed as a civilian liaison to help with the Apache transition to reservation life, a position that would allow him to remain with Ayana while serving both governments. The wedding ceremony that followed combined Apache and white traditions in ways that created something entirely new. Ayana wore her finest traditional dress while Samuel donned the formal clothes he had not worn since leaving civilization. Apache elders offered blessings alongside a civilian minister Morrison had summoned from the nearest town. The exchange of vows took place in both English and Apache, with Ayana and Samuel promising to honor each other's heritage while building a life together that would demonstrate the possibility of love, transcending the boundaries of race and culture. Their words carried hope not just for their personal future, but for the broader relationship between their peoples. As the ceremony concluded, the practical work of relocation began with the efficiency that surprised everyone involved. Apache families loaded their possessions onto wagons provided by the army, while soldiers helped elderly tribal members prepare for the journey to San Carlos. The cooperation between former enemies created an atmosphere that felt more like a community barn-raising than a military operation. Samuel found himself in the unique position of serving as translator, mediator, and cultural bridge during the complex process of helping Apache families adapt to the prospect of reservation life. His presence seemed to ease tensions on both sides, providing reassurance to Apache who feared military betrayal and demonstrating to soldiers that their former enemies were families trying to survive, rather than savage threats to civilization. The journey to San Carlos Reservation took 5 days, during which Samuel and Ayana had time to plan their life together, while helping her people adjust to their new circumstances. They talked about establishing a small ranch near the reservation where they could raise horses and cattle while maintaining connections to both Apache and white communities. More importantly, they discussed their shared vision of serving as an example that might encourage other cross-cultural relationships and gradually break down the barriers of mistrust that had caused so much suffering. Their love had begun with a single act of intervention to protect someone in danger, and they hoped it might grow into something that would protect many others from the hatred and violence that had characterized frontier life for too long. The arrival at San Carlos marked the beginning of a new chapter for everyone involved. Nalnish's band would face the challenges of adapting to a confined life while trying to preserve their cultural identity. Samuel and Ayana would build a marriage that bridged two worlds, while proving that love could overcome the legacy of conflict between peoples who shared the same hopes for their children's futures. As the Arizona sun set over the reservation on their first evening as husband and wife, Samuel and Ayana stood together looking toward a horizon that promised both challenges and possibilities neither could have imagined when they first met. Ca.